Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, the state of Florida has jumped into the redistricting battle. We've got details on our new maps coming up. And a good Tuesday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of the program, you can take it with you 24/7 on demand by checking out the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app. You can also listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning is brought to you by Melissa Gott and the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions or challenges that you might be facing, visit them online. I encourage you to do that. Visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's lawgroupnc.com. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. Before we get started here today, I want to tell you about some changes that we've made to our morning line email. For those that are not familiar, each and every weekday morning at 6:30, send out an email with everything that is going on across the state of North Carolina. And while there's been some pretty big changes there, the morning line email now features stories from all across the state of North Carolina, a story from the west, a story from the east, taking a look at what's going on in Raleigh and Charlotte, as well as a statewide story and the national, kind of the big national story of the day. All of that is available, plus a look at stock futures, today in North Carolina history, and more. All of that is available for free, delivered to your inbox each and every morning at 6:30 a.m. It is a great way to kick off your day. You can subscribe completely for free by visiting the website ncmorningline.com. That's ncmorningline.com. You can go in there, put in your email address, and you'll get that email each and every weekday morning. Just one of the many things that we do here on the Nick Craig Show to keep you up to date with everything going on across the state and the nation outside of our time slot here. ncmorningline.com for the brand new edition of the Morning Line email. All right, let's talk about redistricting. We have spent some time talking about what went on in Virginia over the last couple of weeks. And let me start off by saying and making this point as clear as I possibly can. I don't have a problem with Virginia wanting to redraw their maps to benefit Democrats. I don't have a problem with that. The same way, I don't have a problem with what we saw the North Carolina legislature do late last year, which was do the exact same thing. Redraw congressional districts 1 and 3 to make it more competitive for the GOP. That is not my gripe with Virginia. My gripe is the way in which they proposed these new maps to the voters in Virginia. And if you aren't familiar with how this process went down, there was a constitutional amendment on the ballot just a couple of weeks ago that read as follows. Here is the question. Should the Constitution of Virginia be amended to allow the General Assembly to temporarily adopt new congressional districts, and here's the problem, to restore fairness in the upcoming elections, while ensuring Virginia's standard redistricting process resumes for all future redistricting after the 2030 census? Again, my gripe is not that the Democrat-controlled legislature in Virginia wanted to redraw maps. It was the way in which they posed the question, specifically saying to restore fairness in upcoming elections. That is incredibly disingenuous. What is fair look like? What does the term fairness mean as it relates to congressional maps? I mean, I think that is a fair question to ask, no? What does fairness look like? Fair to all voters in the state? Fair to Democrats? Fair to Republicans? This concept of a fair map that is drawn by a legislature that is inherently political is nonsense. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. And it's one of the reasons why anytime I hear somebody talk about, oh my gosh, we can't have this conversation about gerrymandering, political gerrymandering. Well, no, duh. Of course it's political gerrymandering. Who is responsible for drawing the maps? It's the legislature in almost every single state. What is something that makes the legislature interesting? The fact that individuals are elected based on their party affiliation. So you have states like Virginia that has a Democrat-dominated legislature. You have states like North Carolina and Florida that have a Republican-dominated legislature. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It's not a surprise to me that those state legislatures act in a partisan manner. That's literally what they were elected to do. They were elected as Republicans. They were elected as Democrats to push forward issues that their party agrees with. And in the case of a state like North Carolina, the Republicans for the last 15 years have been successful in convincing voters every 2 years that their party is the best to lead the state moving forward. And of course, as we have covered in great detail here on the Nick Craig Show, we have seen the fruits of those labors come to fruition, with the state being the number one state for business 3 out of the last 5 years, a tax structure for both personal income tax and corporate income tax that is incredibly lucrative for individuals and businesses. It's why we're seeing so much explosion, so much growth here in North Carolina compared to what we saw in years past after 100 years of Democrat control, which was a state that was broke, a state that had no money, and a state that was heavily in debt to the federal government. So this is what the proposed new districts look like in Virginia. Now, it is important to note that right now, the courts in Virginia, the Virginia Supreme Court, has currently put a pause on these maps as there are questions whether the legislature followed the proper process in putting this constitutional amendment on the ballot. Virginia has 11 congressional districts. And so when you look at these 11 districts that are up in Virginia, there is now only one that is going to elect, likely only one that is going to elect a Republican. That is Virginia's 9th congressional district, which covers the vast majority of the western half of the state. The 6th congressional district leans blue in a year where Republicans were doing well in like a Democrat midterm election. 6 might flip red, but in a year like what we're in here in 2026, midterm elections that are likely to heavily favor Democrats, that map will go towards, or that seat rather, will go towards Democrats. Same thing with district number 2. So you're looking at out of 11 congressional districts, 10 will be held by Democrats, 1 will be held by Republicans. Again, if you claimed and said, hey, we're doing this because we, as the Virginia legislature, want to give ourselves more seats in Congress as Democrats, I would say, sure, that's if your constitution allows it, which actually it doesn't, which is why they had to pass a constitutional amendment. But if your constitution allows it and you have the political willpower to do it, have at it. But that is exactly what they didn't do, right? They ginned up this discussion over, well, we need to make sure we're passing a fair map to protect the state of Virginia. So let's ask you if this is fair. Looking at the voter registration in the state of Virginia, 51% of people are registered Democrats, 30% are registered as Republicans, and 20% are independent or unaffiliated. So there's 30% in the state of Virginia, almost 6 million voters registered in the state. 30% of them are Republicans, and those 30% will have one sole Republican representing them in Congress. Again, you want to do that for a partisan reason and come out and say that, which is exactly what the legislature did here in North Carolina. I'm totally fine with it. I have no gripes, no complaints, no concerns whatsoever. When you lie to the voters, when you put this very cleverly worded constitutional amendment on the ballot and claim that you are doing this to, quote, restore fairness in the upcoming election, that is where the root of my problem is, because it is incredibly subjective. And we have now seen with the proposed maps from the Virginia legislature that it is anything but, quote unquote, fair if you were breaking it down based on party affiliation. It is anything but fair if you actually look at the registered voters in the state of Virginia. They lied to their voters to try and get more seats for Democrats. They were incredibly disingenuous and dishonest with this conversation from the start. And that is what pisses me off. That is the problem that I've got with what Virginia has done. Not, again, that they want to redraw maps, but they purposefully lied to their voters, claimed fairness this, fairness that. This has to be fair. That has to be fair. It was total bullshit. It had nothing to do with being fair. It had everything to do with getting more seats. We saw directly out of the horse's mouth here in North Carolina, Senator Ralph Heiss, back in, I don't know, was September of last year, something like that, spoke in front of the North Carolina General Assembly and said, we are redrawing these maps to give Republicans another seat in Congress. He didn't lie. He didn't say that in a backroom meeting that got reported through the North Carolina media. No, he literally said it during a public hearing within the North Carolina General Assembly. You can disagree with wanting to redraw maps. You can disagree with partisan gerrymandering all you want. But there is a difference between being upfront with what you're doing and lying about it. So as we continue this discussion over redistricting, it has been a hot topic now for the better part of a year. Just talked about what went on in Virginia. Still waiting exactly to see how the courts in Virginia are going to play out in all of this. And they've currently got a hold on these new maps. And of course, you know, the clock is ticking on this. You're going to have your district lines drawn relatively soon if you want to, of course, have these candidates elected for the 2026 midterm elections coming up here in November. So that's going to be an interesting piece to follow. We'll keep an eye on those details. And over the last couple of days, we have now turned our attention to the great state of Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis and the Republican-led General Assembly have really been doing an unbelievable job over the last couple of years of bringing forward, again, elected as Republicans, bringing forth a Republican, a conservative agenda to the voters of their state. And with their legislature gaveling in back just a couple of days or a couple of weeks ago and beginning their legislative short session, they have also redrawn their maps in Florida. And Democrats, of course, are surprised by this. Democrats, of course, are coming out and saying, oh my God, can you believe what Ron DeSantis, can you believe what Republicans are doing in the state of Florida? There's one key difference between what Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature did versus what we just talked about and what we saw in Virginia. Ron DeSantis and Republican leaders in Florida said, hey, we're redrawing our maps to give Republicans more seats. Exactly what we saw here in North Carolina. Exactly what we saw in Texas and any other state that has redrawn maps during the last 12 months or so. There's a keen difference between the messaging from the right and the messaging from the left. Republicans come out and say, yeah, we want to give ourselves a better shot at retaining a majority in the House, which is still unlikely to happen. But nevertheless, we want to give ourselves a better opportunity to do that. We want to give ourselves a better shot at retaining the majority. Okay. Again, you can have a philosophical disagreement with gerrymandering, which is a fine discussion to have. But you can't say that Republicans are misleading their voters. You can't claim that the Republican legislatures in Florida, Texas, and North Carolina lied to the citizens of the state, sold them a bill of goods, and then did a complete switch on it. It just didn't happen. It's not true. Versus what you're seeing in California, Virginia, and all of these other Democrat states where they're not just coming out and saying what it is. They masquerade it. They cloak it in this term, fairness or protecting our democracy or one of their other stupid constant terms that they go to describe the things that they're doing. So we have now turned our attention to the state of Florida and look at the brand new maps that are on down there, where previously the state had, I believe, six, I believe, members of Congress that were elected as Democrats. And under the new maps enacted by the Florida legislature, just signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis on Monday, that number has now been cut down to 4. And so you are seeing a state now where Florida, in response to what has gone on in Virginia, what has gone on in other states across the country, they have clapped back. The legislature and Ron DeSantis has said, fine, you want to go down the trail here of partisan gerrymandering? You want to go down the trail here of redistricting? Fine. Then we can do the exact same thing. Our Constitution allows it. Our legislature has the ability to do it. And that is exactly what has gone on in Florida. So this is the previous makeup. In the old rating, there were a couple of seats that were safe Democrats, including Florida's 14th congressional district, Florida's 22nd congressional district, and Florida's 25th congressional district. Those seats have now changed to either likely or lean Republican, with many of the seats staying in either the safe or likely category, giving Republicans the opportunity to pick up potentially as many as 3 or 4 additional seats in the state of Florida. You look at picking up an additional seat here in North Carolina in the 1st congressional district, a couple of other seats in the state of Texas, and then still waiting to see exactly what the Louisiana legislature is going to do after a major Supreme Court case in just the last couple of weeks threw out portions of their maps, claiming that they were drawn with racial data, to looking at Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The United States Supreme Court said, hey, you can't use racial data and explicitly, it didn't say you can't, but it said you can't explicitly use racial data as a premises of redrawing these maps. That has prompted discussions from other states across the Southeast to relook at their maps in their legislative short sessions to determine whether they're going to redraw. And let's talk about partisan gerrymandering here for a second, because the Supreme Court has made it abundantly clear just recently, because of North Carolina, surprise, surprise, that they are no longer going to take up cases as it relates to partisan gerrymandering. And there is a key difference between racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering. Here in North Carolina, lawmakers use no racial data to draw maps. The only data that they are using is partisan data. Now, if that partisan data happens to overlap with racial data, then so be it. But there was no racial data used at all in the state of North Carolina. None. It is all based on party affiliation here in the Tar Heel state. And the Supreme Court has made it abundantly clear in recent Supreme Court decisions over the last few years that cases where legislatures like North Carolina say, hey, we're redrawing our maps, we have the ability to do so, we're going to use partisan data to do it, that the Supreme Court has said these cases are no longer relevant. You cannot sue a legislature. You cannot sue lawmakers. You cannot sue the state for redrawing maps using said partisan data. And so the days of Democrats, every single time a Republican legislature redraws their maps, the days of Democrats filing insane amounts of lawsuits to try and stop that from happening are over. Now, they will, of course, still do so. Mark Elias and all of his left-wing groups that have made it a cottage industry of suing Republican General Assemblies and legislatures across the United States, they're still going to try. They'll probably come up with some new arguments, but the Supreme Court has made it abundantly clear if partisan data is what was used, we're not looking at it. And what that means is that any of these lawsuits that are filed explicitly looking at partisan data, no longer are those suits going to last. They should be, if we're using some of the literature from the United States Supreme Court and taking that to heart, those cases should be very quickly dismissed as they are no longer relevant challenges to those political maps. And so we want to talk about fairness, right? That's what Virginia claimed. That's what they sold their voters. What is going on in the Northeast, where there's a pretty interesting mix of people in terms of their party affiliation? Does the fairness exist in the Northeast half of the United States? We'll get into those details coming up here in just a couple of minutes. Before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and thank them for their continued support of the Nick Craig Show, and remind you that when legal challenges arise or you have any legal questions, there's nobody better to call than Melissa Gott and the amazing team over at the law group here in Wilmington. Going all the way back to 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of our state. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, no matter the issue, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures that your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, ladies and gentlemen. They're not some big national law firm. Melissa Gott and her team live right here in southeastern North Carolina. Their office is located in downtown Wilmington, and they're just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. For any legal questions or challenges, 910-251-6088, or their website, lawgroupnc.com. It's the law group, experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the law group and their continued support of the Nick Craig Show. Quick break, more of the program coming up as we roll on this Tuesday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Thanks for spending some time with us here on a Tuesday as we continue the discussion over redistricting. It has become a very hot term. It's been, for those that follow North Carolina politics very closely, it's been a long time discussion here, going back at least 20 years here in the state. It seems like there's always some legal challenge, some lawsuit, some court bid over redistricting, over some group drawing maps so on and so forth. But it's really kind of trampolined into a much larger national discussion over the last 12 months or so, as we've seen a variety of different states, including now most recently Florida and Virginia, Texas, California, and other states, including North Carolina, looking at redrawing portions of their congressional maps leading into the 2026 midterm elections coming up here in November. And as I mentioned in the open, if legislatures that are controlled by one party or the other want to redraw maps, I don't really have an opinion or a thought on it. If their constitution allows it, if their general statute allows it, and they have the ability and the authority to do so, then they have the right. I mean, at the end of the day, folks, you elect a legislature in whatever state you live, you elect a legislature to do a job. You elect them to do what is in their authority. And so if you don't like them drawing maps or so on and so forth, then you have either two options. You can either pass a constitutional amendment stripping away their authority to do so, or elect different representatives. I mean, that's really the long and the short of the story. You don't have the ability to, at least from my vantage point, you don't have the authority to complain when a legislature does the job in which they're elected to do, which in this case is the authority to redraw maps. So in Virginia, they lied to the citizens, the nearly 6 million voters in that state. They lied to them about the premise of their constitutional amendment that passed by relatively slim margins, only about 3%, just back a couple of weeks ago. In their question that was posed to voters, they asked very clearly, should we redraw maps to, quote, restore fairness, end quote, in upcoming elections? And so the argument there from the Virginia legislature, the Democrat-controlled legislature, was we need to make things, quote unquote, fair, so we're going to redraw maps. And they are in the process of doing so. The courts are currently involved in that. But when it's all said and done, if it is allowed to go forward, which I don't know whether it will or won't, there will be 10 Democrats elected to Congress in Virginia compared to just one Republican. We just looked at Virginia's voter registration. There's 51% registered Democrat, 30.5% registered Republican, 18% are independent or unaffiliated. And I refuse to understand how that is a quote-unquote fair map based on your partisan makeup, based on your voter registration in the state. Now, if the Virginia legislature said, hey, we're going to gerrymander these maps for a partisan reason, I'd say, okay, well, then you guys have the ability, you have the authority to do so, have at it. So this fairness discussion has brought me to the northeast half of the United States, looking at the 119th Congress elected in 2024. The Northeast is suspiciously blue. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island do not have a single Republican representing them in Washington, D.C. Now, does that pass the test of fairness? You've got these states in the Northeast, again, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, the 6 states that make up New England in the Northeast. They have not one elected member to Congress that is a Republican. And so as you start looking into the partisan makeup of these states, this does not pass, quote unquote, fairness by any stretch of the imagination. And the reason I keep using and keep going back to the word fairness and fair is because this is what Democrats claim that they want. This is literally what the Virginia legislature asked their voters to support, saying, hey, we need to make sure that things are fair. So let us redraw the maps and give 10 seats to Democrats, 1 to Republican. So looking at the partisan makeup, we'll start in Maine. There are 33% of voters in Maine are registered as Democrats, followed by 29% that are registered as Republicans, with their largest voting bloc being independent or unaffiliated at 36%. So you've got just a less than 4-point swing in terms of percentage-wise between the registered number of Democrats and Republicans in the state of Maine. Yet you look at their congressional map, there is no elected Republicans in the state of Maine. They've got 2 congressional districts, not 1. How about in the state of New Hampshire, where they have got 2 congressional districts? In New Hampshire, Republicans outnumber Democrats. There are 31.9% of voters in the state of New Hampshire are registered Republicans, compared to 28.1% that are registered as Democrats, followed by 39.9%, almost 40%, who are registered as independent or unaffiliated. Yet in the state of New Hampshire, there are, again, 2 congressional districts, more registered Republicans than there are Democrats, but both of their seats controlled by Democrats. In the state of Vermont, where there's only 1 congressional seat, there are 53% Democrats registered in the state, 26.1% independent or unaffiliated, and 20% Republican. Vermont is probably the only state that gets a pass here, as they only have 1 member of Congress and 53% of the voters are Democrats. So we'll give Vermont a pass. But again, talking about fairness, maybe the state needs to be broken up a little bit and add an additional seat for Republicans. At the end of the day, 20% of the voters in the state are registered as Republicans. Massachusetts is an interesting state based on their party affiliation and breakdown. 67% are registered as independent, 24% as Democrats, only 8% of voters registered as Republicans in all of the Massachusetts congressional delegation. Not a single Republican there. Turning our attention to turning our attention to Connecticut, 43.8% of the voters are registered independent. 35% are Democrat, 21% are Republicans, and surprise, surprise, no Republican representation there. And then finally, Rhode Island, 50% unaffiliated or independent, 34% are registered as Democrats, 14% are registered as Republicans, not a member of Congress that represents Republicans in the state of Rhode Island. So 6 states in the Northeast, in the New England area, the 6 states, from Maine all the way down to Connecticut, there is not a single Republican representative. And specifically looking at New Hampshire and Maine, where you've got, in the case of New Hampshire, more registered Republicans than Democrats. In Maine, a relatively close margin between Democrats and Republicans. There is no Republican voice from those states. Is that a problem to you? Again, if we're premising all of this discussion on fairness, again, using the words directly out of the state of Virginia, if we're talking fairness, that should be a problem. But of course, as you know, and as I know, the Virginia legislature and Democrats in Virginia weren't interested in fairness. They lied to their voters. What they were truly interested in were getting more Democrat seats. And so because they knew that that wasn't palatable to the voters in Virginia, because they knew that if their constitutional amendment said, hey, we want to give Democrats more seats in Congress, it would have failed. They knew that. They were smart enough to figure that out. They had to lie to their voters and masquerade this entire thing and masquerade this entire discussion in quote unquote fairness. It's got to be fair. We need to restore fairness. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. It's a total fallacy in terms of redistricting and these partisan maps. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as fairness because, again, you have a politically elected body that is playing this out. You have individuals that are elected with a party, either Democrats or Republicans, that are drawing these maps. The concept, the notion, the idea of fairness makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But they continued. They ran this constitutional amendment across the entire state. They convinced voters, and a lot of people were honestly misled by what was going on because they truly did not understand exactly what was being asked. Because again, you look at the question, it kind of, most people would say, oh yeah, of course, we would want things to be fair. That would make a lot of sense to me. I think everybody inherently wants some level of fairness in things, right? We all want to have a fair shot, a fair opportunity. That's why the Virginia legislature did what they did. That's why the Democrats that controlled the General Assembly in Virginia put the constitutional amendment on the ballot and worded it the way in which they did. All of this being done on the redistricting front leading up to the midterm elections, in which you've heard me say multiple times now, Democrats are likely to prevail. Why? Not because Democrats have better ideas, not because their policies will slingshot the United States into unbelievable amounts of economic prosperity and safety, but because midterm elections always favor the party that is not in power. And so when you look at Washington, D.C. right now, you look at the House, you look at the Senate, you look at the executive branch, you look in the Oval Office, you see Republicans with their control everywhere. Now, completely different discussion over whether Republicans are doing a satisfactory job or not in Congress. That is a much larger discussion for a different day, as John Thune, the leader of the Senate, has, I would argue, completely failed the Republican voters across the country that elected him and gave Republicans a majority back in 2024, refusing to move forward on very consequential pieces of legislation, including the SAVE Act, which he just refuses to bring to a vote, wants to make sure that Democrats get their way on it. Makes no logical sense whatsoever. And so in politics, this the betting market is something that we've discussed in the past and has really kind of taken off as it relates to politics. So I went over to Polymarket to take a look at what the people are saying as it relates to putting their dollars behind what's going on in the what will be going on in the midterm elections. And no surprise, according to the current odds, and again, these things shift pretty dynamically, and we're still many, many months away from the midterms, and so these numbers will change. But as it stands here right now in early May, according to the Polymarket betting averages, the Democrats have an 83% chance of taking the House, which is no surprise there. We kind of expected that would be the case with these midterm elections coming forward, the Democrats having a major advantage there. The interesting number is over on the Senate side, which I don't think will actually come to fruition. The Polymarket has a 51% chance of Democrats taking the Senate. I suspect that will not actually come to fruition. The likelihood of Democrats being able to flip 4 different seats in the U.S. Senate is going to be tough. They'll, obviously one of the big races is here in North Carolina, where a former head of the RNC and North Carolina Republican Party, Michael Whatley, is battling it against former Democrat Governor Roy Cooper. But that is one of 4 seats that Democrats are going to have to flip to get control of the Senate. Obviously, if they're successful in doing that, then the president in Donald Trump becomes the only individual that can stop the Democrats from enacting a crazy, radical, out-of-control agenda. So there is still a little bit of a safeguard there. And so that is where the current markets stand right now. Again, here in early May, things are likely to change, probably pretty dramatically. We, of course, continue to watch the major issues that unfold here in the United States right now. And I know folks don't like hearing about it, and there's not, the conversation is not consistent, but gas prices and prices in general remain a major problem for the administration to deal with as the war continues to wage in Iran, according to some of the most recent information from Gas Buddy, which does a good job at tracking prices here across the United States. The average for a gallon of gasoline here in the United States is $4.49. When you look at that over the last 3 months, it was just back in late February, early March that gas was under $3 a gallon nationally. That was the average. So we have seen price increases over the last 2 months to the tune of almost $2. So we're seeing a major increase there, which is absolutely affecting the Republican Party and the morale of Republican voters. Right? There's from my vantage point, no question about it. Now, will these prices come under control? I suspect that the answer to that question is yes, they will. This conflict that is ongoing in Iran, I would suspect that will continue to be played out and will likely wrap up before too long. And with that, we should see a pretty steady decline in gas prices. I know that OPEC has announced that they're going to be increasing production. There continues to be other Middle East nations as part of OPEC that have said, hey, you guys need to, we need to be increasing production now that there's some back and forth, some frustration from some of the OPEC nations currently about increasing production and that it's not being done fast enough. Of course, the domestic supply of United States oil is something that needs to be talked about as well. Currently, oil, WTI sweet crude is trading at over $103 a barrel right now, which is way above where it should be, which is why gas prices are so high right now. So that is something that is absolutely probably driving the markets right now as it relates to the midterm elections. It's driving political polling right now because, yes, it is absolutely something that is on the minds of voters as they're going to the gas station and spending $70 filling up their tank when they were filling up for $30 just back a couple of months ago. And I've made this point going back months now. For the Trump administration, the keen focus between now, and when I was saying now, we were talking about this back in November of last year. The key focus now needs to be prices and really nothing else. The president got elected in large part due to the terrible handling of the economy under the Biden administration. We saw record sky-high inflation, record sky-high gas prices through 2022 and 2023. It put a significant strain on the American voter. President Donald Trump and Republicans all across the country ran on reducing those prices, ran on cleaning up that mess. And so in the immediate win for Donald Trump and through the first, almost year of the presidency, we saw that. We saw prices start to come down. We saw gas prices normalize. But since the conflict with Iran over the last 2 months or so has taken shape, those prices, and specifically the gasoline prices and oil prices, have skyrocketed. And it's something that is going to have to be dealt with. Now, again, the one thing I'll always fall back on is the president and the people that he has surrounded himself with are not morons. They're not idiots. They've got a very close ear to the ground, and they know what's going on. Right? They listen to what the people are actually saying. They know that this remains a major concern. And so as questions over the Strait of Hormuz continue, this very, very fragile, if you even want to call it that, ceasefire deal that continues to take place, getting more and more oil traversing through the strait is something that, from all accounts, this administration is laser focused on. The question is going to be, how quickly does this happen and how quickly do the prices begin to fall? Because I can promise you this, if gas prices are still at or above $4 or even $3.50 a gallon leading into the midterm elections, Republicans are going to get creamed at the ballot box. Republicans are not going to have a fighting chance in the House and potentially risk the opportunity of losing the United States Senate. There is no question that that is going to happen with prices that high. Now, how quickly can this be resolved? Again, how quickly can prices fall? To me, that is kind of the $1 million question in all of this. We were told short-term conflict. I still believe that we are within that window of a short-term conflict, and from all accounts and looking at a variety of different news articles and reports, listening directly to the president himself as he's always speaking to the media, he understands that this is a real risk. He understands that this is a real threat to the Republicans and really to the nation as a whole. And him and his team continue, from all accounts, day in and day out into the late hours of the evening, the early morning hours, continue to try and find a way to resolve said conflict and get the Strait of Hormuz open, and so that these oil and gas prices will continue to fall. So we'll keep an eye on all of that, as we'll have very extensive coverage of the midterm elections, not only here in North Carolina, but across the nation, right here on the Nick Craig Show. Great comment coming in. Trump is waiting for the pipelines in Iran to coagulate when they will say uncle. In my opinion, any attacks on our Navy will equal bridges being bombed. Yep, that is same thing that I've been reading as well, is that because they don't have the ability, Iran does not have the ability to currently export large amounts of oil, that they are kind of in this position where there's going to be a backup, where there's no other place to store it, and that could create some very significant problems for their ability to refine oil and gas products right there on the shore of the Strait of Hormuz. And so that presumably could be coming, I guess, in the next couple of days, maybe next couple of weeks. We'll keep an eye on that and again see. Nothing from my vantage point. Nothing has changed in terms of the conflict itself. The United States still has all of the leverage, all of the upper hand. The Iranian regime, whatever is left in the Iranian regime, has nothing. They have no cards. They have nothing to really bargain with the United States, and I suspect that they're going to be forced into a deal one way or the other. So we'll be keeping an eye on that as we get new relevant information. We'll bring it to you right here on the Nick Craig Show. Again, don't forget to check out the Morning Line email delivered to your inbox free every weekday morning at 6:30 a.m. Visit ncmorningline.com and sign up completely free. That's ncmorningline.com. Well, thanks to the law group here in Wilmington for their continued support for any legal challenges you might be facing. Visit them online at lawgroupnc.com or give them a call, 910-251-6088. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and is heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your Tuesday. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on The Nick Craig Show.